They said the wind stopped that night, as if the air itself refused to carry the sound of what happened in the fields of St. Bartholomew Plantation. The overseer's lantern went out before it hit the ground. And by morning, one man's name would never be spoken above a whisper again. Before we continue, take a breath. The past is closer than you think. Subscribe to remember what others forgot. The year was 1821. The Louisiana Delta lay drowned in fog, its plantations crouched along the river like beasts asleep after feeding. In the murk stood the house of Laurent Devereaux, a man whose cruelty was legend long before the century grew old. He was said to own not only the bodies of men but the sound of their pain. The whip was his punctuation, obedience his only poetry. Among the enslaved was a young man called Elias, tall, quiet, the kind whose silence made overseers nervous. He had eyes the color of burnt oak and the patience of someone who had waited too long for the sun to rise. No one knew where he came from. Some said Georgia. Others whispered Haiti. A few claimed he had the blood of kings who'd once ruled far across the ocean, before being dragged to this damp corner of hell. Elias worked the sugar mill. He spoke little, moved with precision, and carried a stillness that frightened men used to breaking spirits. He would often stare at the Devereaux mansion, the tall white columns ghosting in the fog, as if trying to see through its walls. Inside that mansion lived Madame Celeste Devereaux, Laurent's wife, a woman whose beauty was both her power and her prison. Her skin was pale as the lily she never planted, her voice soft and low, but her eyes told stories of storms she'd never dared to name. Rumor said she had come from France as a bride at 17, and by 20 she had already learned the art of silence. The slaves knew not to look directly at her. Yet sometimes, from the upper balcony, she would look down at them, and her gaze would linger just a moment too long on the man named Elias. The night it began, the storm had rolled in without warning. The wind screamed through the cane like lost souls. Laurent Devereaux was drunk again, the kind of drunk that makes men remember they have power and go looking for someone weaker to prove it. He called for Elias. In the great hall, the master's boots left mud across the marble floor. The firelight danced on the whip hanging from his hand, black, slick, and alive. Elias stood before him, silent, shoulders squared. Laurent laughed. "You've been looking too long at my wife," he slurred. "Think I don't see it? Think she doesn't?" Celeste appeared at the top of the stairs, wrapped in a shawl. Her face was pale, her eyes wet with terror. "Laurent, please," she whispered. "He's done nothing." "Nothing?" The whip cracked, the sound splitting the air like lightning. "He's breathing. That's enough." The next moments were chaos and fire. The lantern fell. The wind screamed through broken glass. When it was over, the whip lay coiled on the floor, and Laurent Devereaux's body was no longer moving. They said Elias didn't run. He simply stood there, watching the master's blood soak into the marble, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate calm. Celeste knelt beside the corpse, her trembling hand reaching toward Elias. "You can't stay," she said, voice trembling. "They'll hang you by dawn." But Elias only looked at her and said quietly, "Then dawn will have to wait." Outside, the storm tore through the cane fields, washing away footprints and sin alike. The plantation slept uneasily, unaware that its master's reign had ended, and that something far older, far more dangerous, had just awakened beneath its soil. The slaves would later say they heard singing in the wind that night, not human, not divine, something between vengeance and deliverance. And when the morning came, Laurent Devereaux was dead, his widow silent, and Elias nowhere to be found. Yet from that silence, a legend began to breathe. They found the master's body before sunrise. His face had gone the color of cold ash, his eyes frozen wide open as if death had surprised even him. The house slaves were ordered to wash the blood from the floor, but the stain beneath the marble never faded. Some said it grew darker with every rainfall. By the time the sheriff arrived from Baton Rouge, the storm had already erased every trace of Elias's footprints. Only Madame Celeste remained in her room, pale as porcelain, her eyes fixed on the window that faced the river. When asked what had happened, she said only one thing. The storm took him. But those who worked the fields knew better. They'd seen Elias slip through the cane before the thunder rolled. Some said he vanished into the swamps where even the hounds refused to follow. Others swore he was seen walking along the levee at dawn, his shirt torn, his hands red with something not yet dry. For weeks, the plantation lived like a body without a heart. The overseers whispered that Madame Celeste had lost her mind. She stopped attending Sunday Mass, stopped eating at the long dining table where Laurent once presided like a god. At night, the servants would hear her pacing through the halls, barefoot, whispering a name, not her husband's. Elias. In the marshlands south of the property, he built a refuge of mud and silence. He lived like a shadow among cypress and fog, feeding on roots and rainwater. The nights were long, and the swamp hummed with voices older than memory. He had killed a man, yes, but not merely for rage. He had killed the weight that had crushed generations before him. Yet freedom tasted hollow without meaning, without her. One evening, as the sun died behind the moss-draped trees, Elias heard the soft creak of an oar. A small boat glided through the fog, its passenger cloaked and still. When it reached the bank, he saw her, Celeste Devereaux, wrapped in black, her pale face flickering in the lantern's light. "I brought you food," she whispered. "And a change of clothes." He stared at her, disbelief and dread warring in his chest. "You shouldn't be here. They'll kill you for it." "They already think I'm mad," she said softly. "Let them." The swamp was silent but for the croak of frogs and the distant howl of wolves. Celeste reached into her satchel and pulled out something wrapped in linen. A golden locket, small, delicate and familiar. "He gave this to me on our wedding day," she said. "Now I give it to you." Elias looked at it, the gold reflecting the trembling lantern flame. "Why?" "Because I want to forget what he made of me," she said. "And I can't do that alone." That night, under the shroud of Spanish moss, they became something neither slave nor mistress, just two haunted souls who had outlived the boundaries of their world. But peace was a fragile thing. Back at the plantation, Laurence's brother, Henri Devereaux, had arrived from New Orleans to claim the estate and investigate the murder. Henri was a colder man, not as violent but far more calculating. He had the face of someone who smiled only when it hurt others. When he first saw Celeste, he bowed with mock courtesy. "Such a tragedy," he said. "But perhaps, sister, God has given us a chance to rebuild." Celeste met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean to take his place?" Henri smiled faintly. "Someone must." He wasted no time restoring order. The whips returned, the fields filled with screams again, and the old fear crept back like a sickness. But there was something Henri did not know. The slaves whispered that their dead master's ghost had risen, that the spirit of the man he wronged had taken form. Each night, Henri heard footsteps in the hall outside his room. The air grew heavy. The mirrors fogged though no fire burned. And on more than one night, he swore he saw his brother's shadow bending over his bed, but the eyes staring back were not human. Weeks later, a body was found floating near the river, one of Henri's overseers. His skin was burned in strange, circular marks as if touched by hands of flame. The fear spread fast. Henri began to suspect Celeste. Her mourning was too quiet, her eyes too calm. When he followed her one evening and saw her leaving through the back gardens toward the swamp, he decided to follow, rifle in hand. The fog swallowed him whole. The deeper he went, the quieter the night became. Then he saw them, two silhouettes by the lantern's glow. Celeste standing close to a tall man whose face Henri couldn't yet see. "Celeste," he called out, voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "Step away from him." The figures turned. The man stepped into the light, and Henri froze. It was Elias. But the eyes that met his were not the eyes of any mortal man. Henri's breath turned to mist in the cold swamp air. The rifle in his trembling hands felt heavier than iron, as if the darkness itself resisted his grip. Across the murky water, Elias stood half-shrouded in fog, his body lean and still, his gaze calm, too calm. Beside him, Celeste's lantern flickered wildly, casting long writhing shadows that made the trees seem alive. "Celeste," Henri hissed through clenched teeth. "Do you know what you're doing?" Her voice was steady. "Yes, Henri. I do." "She's bewitched," Henri spat, raising his rifle. "You think you can crawl out of your place, boy? You think killing my brother made you a man?" Elias didn't flinch. "I didn't kill a man," he said quietly. "I killed a monster." Henri's finger tightened on the trigger. Celeste stepped forward, her voice breaking through the thick, humid silence. "Henri, please." The shot split the night. The lantern fell. Celeste screamed as Elias staggered backward, the bullet grazing his shoulder. The swamp exploded with sound, frogs, birds, the thunder of Henri's boots in the mud. Celeste grabbed Elias by the arm, dragging him into the reeds as Henri fired again. The shot echoed across the water but struck nothing but fog. By the time Henri reached the riverbank, there was only the lantern, flickering weakly on its side, its light trembling like a dying breath. He cursed under his breath. The water rippled. Something moved beneath the surface. A faint whisper rose through the reeds, Elias's voice carried by the current. "You'll pay for what your brother built." Henri fired into the dark again, but the sound only mocked him. He turned back toward the plantation, unaware that something had followed him from the swamp. That night, Celeste tended Elias's wound by the faint glow of a hidden fire deep in the cypress maze. The bullet had only grazed him, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. She tore her sleeve, pressing it to his shoulder. "You should have let me go alone," she whispered. "I'd rather die than see you fall to him," Elias replied, voice hoarse. Celeste looked into his eyes that carried the memory of chains and flame, and something inside her broke. "Then we can't stay here," she said. "If Henri finds us again—" "He won't," Elias interrupted. "Not after tonight." He stood, pain tightening every muscle in his body, and walked toward the water's edge. "The river remembers every soul they drowned here," he said. "And it's hungry." The swamp shivered with wind. The reeds bent. And for a moment Celeste thought she saw shapes beneath the surface, pale, human shapes moving like restless spirits. Elias whispered to them in a tongue older than prayer. When Henri returned to the plantation, drenched in sweat and mud, the servants lowered their eyes. The storm clouds above the house were thick and unmoving, as if the sky itself refused to let the sun in. He went straight to his late brother's office, now his office, and poured himself a glass of bourbon. The fire in the hearth refused to light, the matches hissing into smoke. As he sank into the chair, the sound of dripping water reached his ear. He looked up. A thin stream trickled down the wall, though the roof above was dry. He followed it with his eyes and froze. From the ceiling beams, drops of blood were falling. Henri stumbled back, knocking over the glass. His heart hammered as he looked up, and for a split second he saw what no living man should see. Laurent Devereaux, or something wearing his face, hung upside down from the rafters, eyes wide open, a cruel grin stretching across his lifeless mouth. Then it vanished. Henri fell to his knees, trembling. "God help me," he whispered. But even God had long abandoned that house. Back in the swamp, Elias opened his eyes. He felt the ripple through his blood, the connection between the dead and the living tightening like a chain. Celeste looked at him, fear mingled with awe. "What did you do?" she whispered. Elias's voice was calm. "I woke them." The next morning the river turned red. Fish floated belly up. The overseers refused to go near the water. And every mirror in the main house cracked before dawn. Henri called for a priest, but the old man refused to enter the property. "This land," he said, "belongs to the dead now." By sunset Henri stood on the veranda, staring at the horizon. The sky was bleeding gold and crimson, and the fields seemed to whisper his name. Far beyond, in the shadows of the swamp, Elias watched the house burn with the color of vengeance. Celeste stood beside him, her hand trembling in his. The war between the living and the cursed had just begun. By the third night, not a single servant remained within the Devereaux estate. They fled at sundown, whispering prayers under their breath, clutching charms made of river reeds and salt. They said the house was breathing now, its walls pulsing faintly, its doors sighing as if alive. Henri stood alone within it, pacing the length of the hallway like a hunted animal. Every candle flickered out as soon as he passed, every reflection shifted when he looked too long. The portraits of his ancestors, proud men and jeweled women, had begun to warp. Their painted eyes bled color, their smiles twisting. And in every shadow, in every pane of cracked glass, he swore he saw Elias. The swamp was louder that night. The frogs croaked in strange rhythm, and the wind carried human murmurs through the moss. Henri poured himself another drink, his hands shaking, his shirt collar damp with sweat. "You're dead," he said aloud. "You and your witch." The fire in the hearth sputtered. The floorboards moaned. Then from behind him a voice spoke, calm, low, and unmistakably real. "Dead doesn't mean gone." Henri turned, rifle in hand, eyes wide. Elias stood by the doorway, half hidden in the candle's last light, his shirt still torn from the wound Henri had given him. Celeste lingered just behind him, her face unreadable, pale as ash. Henri aimed. You're nothing but a man," Elias finished for him. "A man who took back what was stolen. You killed my brother." "I freed him from himself," Elias said quietly. "The river took the rest." Henri's laughter was cracked and hollow. "And what now? You'll kill me too?" Elias took a step forward. "No. You'll do that yourself." Before Henri could fire, the house shuddered violently, chandeliers crashing, mirrors exploding. A wind rushed through the corridors like a howl from the grave. Henri stumbled back as the portraits ignited one by one, flames crawling down the walls like veins of hellfire. Celeste covered her ears, whispering something in Latin. A plea or a curse, Elias couldn't tell. The air grew thick with smoke and whispers. The voices of the drowned, the slaves buried beneath the fields, were rising. Henri ran for the door, but it slammed shut before he reached it. The glass of bourbon shattered at his feet, spilling like blood. "What do you want from me?" he screamed. Elias's eyes glowed faintly in the smoke. "Not me. Them." The walls began to drip water, thick, dark water that smelled of iron and death. It rose around Henry's boots, then to his knees. He tried to move, but something caught his leg, a hand, slick and cold, reaching from the flooded floorboards. Another followed, then another. "No, no, please." Henri thrashed, firing blindly, but the bullets sank soundlessly into the dark. Celeste turned away as the water climbed higher, the room filling with the wails of the past. Elias stepped closer, his voice low and merciless. "This land drank our blood for years. Tonight it drinks yours." Henry's scream echoed once, sharp, human, final, before the water swallowed him whole. Silence followed. The fire dimmed. The air cooled. When the sun rose the next morning, the Devereux house stood quiet, untouched. The windows unbroken, the walls clean. But every mirror was gone. Only the faint smell of salt and smoke lingered. For 3 days no one entered. On the 4th, Celeste walked through the open gate, barefoot, her white dress trailing mud. She found Elias standing in the courtyard, staring at the fields that once enslaved hundreds. "It's over," she said softly. Elias didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, the land he had inherited not through fortune but through fire. "No," he said at last. "It's only beginning." That evening he gathered the survivors, men and women who had once been chained to this soil, and told them the truth. The masters were gone. The land was theirs now. Together they built fires that burned through the night, not for destruction but for cleansing. Celeste stood beside Elias as the flames consumed the last of the Devereux estate. In their light he looked neither slave nor master, something older, something forged by pain and faith. When dawn broke, the swamp was still again. The river ran clear. The cries of the dead had quieted. But legend says that on certain nights, when the fog rises thick and the crickets fall silent, the Devereux fields still glow faintly with embers, and a tall figure can be seen by the water's edge. A man with eyes like dying fire, watching the house that once owned him. Some say it's Elias, guarding the land he reclaimed. Others whisper it's Henri, doomed to wander the edges of the river he drowned in. Either way the story remains. By the time the dawn came, the house smelled of wax and rain. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the timbers, each groan of the beams a whisper of what had been done. The master was dead. His blood had been washed away, though the stain beneath the floorboards refused to fade. The crows knew. They perched along the fence posts in a silent congregation, blacker than sin, watching the house as though waiting for it to confess. Elias hadn't slept. His hands trembled as he poured water over them, watching the stream run red for the briefest second before turning clear. His reflection in the basin was unrecognizable, eyes hollow, skin marked with the shadow of guilt and something else, something new. Freedom. It felt heavier than chains. The door creaked behind him. "Don't wash it all away," came a voice, low, smooth and cracked at the edges. The widow stood there, hair unbound, face pale as bone in the morning light. He deserved every drop of it. Elias turned but didn't speak. The woman before him was no longer the trembling, delicate wife she'd been hours ago. There was steel in her voice now, something forged in grief and fire. She stepped closer, the hem of her gown dragging through the damp floor. "He treated you like an animal," she said. "Treated me worse. And now," her hand brushed the wooden table, fingertips trailing across the place where the candle had melted down to its base. "Now the Lord has done what we could not." Elias didn't answer. His silence unnerved her, yet she didn't stop. "I've thought about this," she continued, her tone a whisper meant for no one else. "What will they say when they come? When they find him gone? When they find you still here?" He looked up then, meeting her gaze. "They'll hang me," he said simply. "Not if I tell them he left. That he ran off. Men like him have debts, secrets. He could vanish and none would question it." She took another step closer, her voice trembling now, but with urgency, not fear. "You saved me. You saved this house from him. And now you can save yourself, by staying." Elias frowned. "Stay." Her eyes softened. "You've kept this place alive for years. You know every inch of the fields, every man who works them. Without you the land dies and so do I. The words hung between them like the smoke still rising from the extinguished candle. Outside, the wind stirred the dead leaves against the window, whispering like voices too faint to understand. Elias turned away. "I can't," he murmured. "I don't belong here." "You belong nowhere else," she said, more sharply than intended. Then after a breath, "Elias, I won't let them take you. Not after what we've both lost." The room fell silent but for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Elias could hear the house breathing, every board expanding and sighing as if bearing witness to their secret. His heart beat like a drum buried in earth. The widow reached out, hesitating, then let her hand rest against his arm. "Let me do this. Let me protect you." He looked at her then, the pale face streaked with tears, the trembling lip, the eyes that no longer belonged to a grieving wife but to something changed, something dangerous. "Why?" he asked. She smiled faintly, her mouth curving in a way that was almost sorrowful. "Because if they take you," she whispered, "they'll take what's left of me too." It was not love she offered. It was survival. But in that moment, the difference was blurred by the hush of the house and the ghost of the storm outside. Days passed in slow, suffocating silence. The body was buried where the soil was softest, beneath the old magnolia whose roots had always reached too far. She said a prayer under her breath. Elias said nothing. He'd buried enough men to know prayers were just words carried away by wind. At night he heard her crying through the walls. Then one evening the crying stopped, replaced by the slow rhythmic sound of footsteps pacing above his room. When he climbed the stairs she was standing by the window staring at the moonlit fields. "They'll come soon," she said. "His brothers, his friends. They'll want to see the will. And when they do, they'll find what I want them to find." Her tone was calm now, unnervingly so. She turned toward him. "I've rewritten it. You'll stay here as manager. You'll oversee the land, the workers. In time they'll forget who owned it first." Elias stared at her, the unease coiling in his chest. "And what will they say of us?" Her lips parted, a shadow of a smile crossing them. "They'll say I took pity on you, that I couldn't bear to be alone." The lie was simple enough to believe. Too simple, perhaps. Elias nodded once. But something inside him, a voice long buried, whispered that pity had nothing to do with what bound them now. It was something far darker. Shared blood. Shared sin. The widow's gaze lingered on him as he turned to leave. "Elias," she said softly, almost tenderly, "you're not just a servant anymore. You're the reason I'm still breathing." He paused at the door, not trusting himself to look back. "Then pray," he said, "that I keep breathing too." Outside, the field stretched endless beneath a gray sky. The magnolia tree swayed, heavy with the secret buried beneath it. And somewhere deep in the house a single floorboard creaked. Once then twice, though no one was walking there. The house had begun to remember. The summer that followed was quieter than any before it. Too quiet, as though the fields themselves held their breath. The wind no longer carried the usual hum of laughter from the quarters, nor the barked orders of a master. Even the crows had grown solemn, circling only once before vanishing into the gray horizon. The widow, now simply called Madame Lillian by those who dared speak of her, moved through the house like a ghost with purpose. Her mourning veil hung for propriety, but beneath it, her eyes gleamed with a sharpness that unsettled anyone who met them. She was not broken by her husband's death, she had been reborn through it. And beside her, always a few steps behind, was Elias. No one knew what to call him anymore. He was no longer property, yet not quite free. To the townsfolk, he was a strange presence, silent, obedient, always near the widow but never looking her in the eye in public. In private, however, the boundaries between them blurred like smoke around a candle. Their secret began as necessity. She needed someone to run the estate, he needed somewhere to disappear. But need, like rot, spreads quietly. At dusk, they would dine alone at a long table once filled with guests. The silverware still gleamed, the candlelight still trembled. But every sound, the clink of a cup, the creak of a chair, seemed louder now, surrounded by the kind of silence that made the dead feel close. "You've done well," Lillian said one evening, her voice soft but steady. "The workers respect you more than they ever did him." Elias kept his eyes on the floor. "They respect the land. Not me." She studied him for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "You think I don't see what you've done? You've kept this place alive. Without you, it would have rotted like the rest of them." He looked up then and something flickered between them, a recognition, a fragile bond built on shared guilt. But the house did not forget. Some nights, Elias heard footsteps in the hall, slow and dragging, as though someone heavy was being pulled across the floor. Other nights he smelled smoke when there was no fire. Once he found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the master's study, prints too large to be his own. He told himself it was his mind playing tricks, the ghost of guilt refusing to die. Yet when he mentioned it to Lillian, her reaction was not fear. "Let him walk," she said quietly without turning from the window. "Let him see what we've built in his place." Elias didn't ask what she meant. Some truths were better left unspoken. Days turned into weeks. The estate began to thrive again. Crops grew thicker, richer. Buyers returned. Lillian's name carried weight in town, whispered with a mix of admiration and suspicion. But there were questions. "Strange," said one merchant. "A woman alone keeping that land running. And that man of hers, what's he to her?" "Her overseer," said another. "Or her shadow." By the time autumn crept in, rumors had taken root. Some said Elias was her protector. Others whispered darker things, that the widow had fallen under a spell, that her servant had bewitched her, that she slept in the same room where her husband had died. Elias heard the whispers but said nothing. He had grown used to silence. It was the only thing that didn't betray him. Then came the visit. 3 riders arrived one cold morning, 2 men in fine coats and 1 woman in black. They claimed to be the late master's kin. Lillian greeted them with all the grace of a woman with nothing to hide. But her hand trembled only once, when the eldest brother removed his hat and said, "We've come to see the will." For a moment the air turned solid. Elias stood by the doorway, his shadow long across the floor. Lillian smiled, but it was a brittle thing. "Of course," she said, "you shall have what you came for." That night, Elias found her in the study, staring at the documents she'd forged months before. The ink was fading. The seal, her husband's seal, looked uneven in the candlelight. "They'll know," Elias said quietly. "Then we'll make sure they don't," she replied. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the flame, her eyes reflecting it like polished glass. "Do you trust me?" He hesitated. "I trust what we've done." "That's not the same," she whispered. He didn't answer. Later that night, the visitors stayed in the guest rooms. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, like fists against the shutters. Elias couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house seemed to whisper they know. And then, the scream. It came from the east wing, sharp enough to cut through thunder. By the time Elias reached the hall, Lillian was already there, lantern in hand. The brothers' door was open. Inside, the sheets were soaked with blood, and the window was wide open to the storm. The man's throat was torn open, not by blade but by something ragged, feral. Lillian stood frozen, the lantern trembling in her hand. "It wasn't us," she whispered, though Elias hadn't spoken. "It wasn't us." But he saw it then, muddy footprints again, leading away from the bed, trailing down the hall, straight toward the cellar door. And he knew, with a hollow certainty that chilled him to the core, that the dead master was still walking his house. The silent arrangement had ended. The haunting had begun. The manor never slept again after that storm. Even when the night lay still, a sound could be heard beneath the floorboards, like something alive shifting through the coal pits, breathing with the rhythm of the earth. The slaves stopped entering the lower halls after dusk. The servants refused to light the furnace unless Elias himself stood beside them. It began with a smell. Not of rot or smoke but something metallic, like blood burning on iron. The scent drifted up through the grates, faint but constant. Margaret said it was the damp coal. Elias knew better. He had seen the fire that night, the furnace roaring with unnatural heat, flames turning from red to blue to a white so pure it hurt the eyes. The same furnace that once fed the sugar mills now devoured something unseen. One evening he descended alone, lantern in hand. The air grew warmer with each step, the stone walls pulsing with an oily sheen. When he reached the furnace room, the glow was already spilling through the cracks, too bright for any ordinary flame. Elias opened the iron hatch. Inside, the coal lay perfectly still, yet the light moved beneath it, flickering like eyes opening in the dark. He slammed the door shut. But the hum continued. From behind him, a voice whispered, "He never left." Elias turned sharply. No one stood there. Only shadows stretched along the wall, longer than they should have been. He backed away, lantern trembling slightly. Then came a sound he could not mistake, the dragging of boots on stone. The late Master Whitfield's boots. The hairs on his neck rose. He turned the lantern toward the doorway. Empty. Yet when he looked down, there they were, 2 faint, wet prints, leading away into the black. The next morning, Margaret found him sitting in the yard before dawn, bareheaded, staring at the cane fields. His face was pale, his hands black with soot. "You went down there, didn't you?" she said quietly. He didn't answer. "Tell me what you saw." Elias shook his head. "He's not gone." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Ghosts can't harm the living." Elias looked at her then, slow, measured. "That depends who's living." Later that week, the overseer's old office caught fire. The flames spread fast, devouring paper, ledgers, and the wooden floor beneath. When the blaze was finally smothered, nothing remained but ashes, and in those ashes, a single boot print facing the door. The field hands began murmuring prayers between tasks. Some carved crosses into the bark of trees, others refused to work after sundown. Rumors spread that Elias had bargained with the devil, that the furnace was his altar. Margaret did little to silence them. Instead, she watched Elias with growing fascination, her grief turning to something stranger, reverence, perhaps. "You've tamed them," she told him one evening. "Even their fear obeys you." Elias's eyes glinted in the candlelight. "Fear is easier to rule than loyalty." "You sound like him," she said softly. "Maybe that's why you keep me," he replied. She smiled faintly, a sorrowful twist of the lips. "Perhaps it is." The nights grew longer. Smoke began to leak from the cracks in the cellar even when the furnace wasn't lit. Once, Elias swore he saw a shape moving through it, a man's outline made of ash. Then came the night of the black rain. It began just after midnight, a drizzle so thick it stained the earth. The drops struck the roof with a hiss, leaving trails of soot on every window pane. The air turned bitter, choking. Margaret woke to the sound of pounding on her chamber door. Elias stood there, coat-drenched, eyes dark with fury and something else, fear. "It's in the fields," he said. "The fire." They ran out together. Across the horizon, the sugarcane blazed in lines, perfect, deliberate lines like symbols drawn in flame. The fire didn't spread naturally. It moved in circles, enclosing the manor like a noose. Elias shouted orders, but the workers froze, unwilling to go near. The heat rolled over them, thick and suffocating. Margaret covered her mouth. "It's spelling something," she whispered. Indeed, the burning paths were not random, they formed letters, great twisting shapes of fire across the land. Elias stared in horror as the word took shape, Whitfield. By dawn, half the fields were gone. And still the coal furnace below the manor glowed, though no one had fed it. That morning Elias went down again. The iron hatch was cold, but when he opened it he found no fire, only blackness, deep and hollow. And from that blackness came a faint voice, soft as breath. "Elias." He froze. "You took his place," it said. "Now take his sins." He stumbled back, lantern swinging wildly. For a heartbeat, the darkness within the furnace rippled like water, and in it, he saw the reflection of his own face burning. He slammed the door shut, panting, and when he looked down, he realized his hands were covered not in soot, but in blood. Upstairs, Margaret waited by the window, her expression unreadable as she watched smoke rise from the earth. The plantation, once a monument to wealth and cruelty, now belonged to the dead, and to the man who had become their keeper. They said the air never cleared after that night. That even when the wind changed, it still smelled faintly of burnt sugar and bone. The plantation, once humming with labor, laughter, cruelty, now moved like a fever dream, half dead, half awake. Elias no longer slept. He walked the halls at night with a lantern, his steps echoing against the wooden floorboards. Every sound seemed amplified, the groan of beams, the faint rustle of curtains, the sigh of the walls breathing. The house had become a living thing, fed by whispers and smoke. Margaret stayed mostly in her room now, her silks exchanged for morning black. Some nights she would summon Elias without a word, her eyes glassy, her voice distant. Their conversations grew stranger, heavier with silence. "Do you believe in damnation?" she asked one night, staring at the candelabra between them. "I've lived in it," Elias said. "And redemption?" He smiled faintly. "That belongs to the ones who write history." Margaret's fingers toyed with her ring, the gold dulled from years of wear. "You could leave, you know. Take what you've built. The world beyond these gates wouldn't follow." Elias looked toward the window, where moonlight touched the distant smoke of the still glowing fields. "The world doesn't need to follow," he said quietly. "It's already here." That was when the scratching began again. At first faint, like a rat clawing through the boards. Then sharper, more deliberate, scrape, scrape, pause. Coming from beneath the parlor floor. The servants refused to enter. Elias ordered them away, but the noise continued every night, a steady rhythm that grew louder with each passing hour, until it seemed the entire house was gnawing at itself. Finally he pried up the boards. Beneath the floor was a hollow space, a cavity filled with black soil and something that glinted in the lamplight. Buttons. Buckles. A tarnished cufflink with the initials H.W., Henry Whitfield. The late master's monogram. Margaret gasped when she saw it. "You buried him here?" Elias stared into the pit. "I burned him." "Then what is that?" He reached down slowly, his hand trembling as his fingers brushed cold metal. Beneath the ash, something soft met his touch. Fabric, skin, hair. Elias jerked back. "It's him." Margaret stepped closer, her face pale. "But you said." "I did. I swear I did." The thing in the hole twitched. Elias stumbled backward, lantern clattering to the floor. Flames leapt across the boards, casting wild shadows across the walls. The body, or whatever remained of it, shifted once more, the faintest breath escaping its lips. "Help me," it whispered. The fire surged. Elias yanked Margaret away, dragging her into the hall as smoke filled the air. The house moaned, timbers cracking, portraits falling from their hooks. For a moment he thought it was ending, the curse, the whispers, everything. But the next morning the fire was gone. Not a single beam was charred. The boards he'd ripped up were back in place as though untouched. Only the smell remained, thick, bitter, human. Margaret refused to enter that room again. Elias, though, couldn't stay away. Every night he'd return, place his ear to the floor and listen. The voice beneath would whisper names, 17 of them. The same number of plantation owners who had perished in the old uprising before his time. 17 who had burned. 17 who had built the empire of the Whitfields. And at the end of the list it would whisper one more name, Elias Whitfield. He tried to silence it. He scattered salt, read prayers the preacher once used before the floggings, even burned the holy book itself when the words began to shift on the page. But the whispers persisted. Then one night Margaret entered without knocking. She held a small box, cedar, ornate, old enough to smell of the sea. "This belonged to him," she said softly. Inside lay a folded letter, brittle with age. Elias unfolded it carefully. "My dearest Margaret, if this reaches you, I am already gone. Do not let him near the furnace. Do not let him touch the coal. His blood carries the fire we feared. It is not of God. Burn the fields if you must, but never him." The signature was faint, smudged, but there, the name Henry Whitfield. Margaret's hands trembled. "He wrote this before he died." Elias looked up, the letter crumpling slightly in his grasp. "He feared me before I even existed." Margaret took a step back. "What are you saying?" "I think," Elias said slowly, "this house has been waiting for me longer than either of us knew." The candles flickered violently. The air turned heavy. Margaret whispered, "What are you?" Elias looked toward the floorboards where faint smoke curled between the cracks. "I'm what they made," he said. "And now I will finish what they began." That night the pact was made. Elias went to the cellar, stood before the furnace and opened the iron hatch. The glow within pulsed like a heartbeat. He spoke the 17 names, one by one, until the last echoed into silence. Then he added his own. The flames roared, white, blinding, alive. When the door slammed shut, the whole manor shook as though the earth had drawn breath. From that night forward, no fire ever burned out on Whitfield land. Not the lamps, not the hearths, not even the candles that guttered down to their last wick. Every flame burned longer than it should, fed by something unseen. And Elias, standing at the window, felt no warmth at all. The house had gone silent again, but silence in Whitfield Manor was never a comfort. It was the kind that lingered, thick as breath, patient as death. It filled every room, every corridor, seeping into the velvet drapes and hollowing out the clocks that had long stopped ticking. Only the faint hiss of candles and the murmur of unseen drafts disturbed the air. Margaret moved through the halls like a specter. Her morning gown trailed softly, whispering against the polished floorboards. She hadn't slept in days. The servants had all left after the night of the furnace's awakening. Some fled screaming, others vanished before dawn. Elias hadn't stopped them. He only watched from the upper balcony, his face half lit by candlelight, the faint burn marks still visible on his palms. He was changing. She could feel it more than see it. His reflection no longer matched him. In mirrors he appeared taller, darker, almost translucent around the edges. Once she swore she saw two figures standing where he stood, one solid, one made of smoke. That morning she found him in the study, staring at an old painting that hung crooked on the wall. It was of Henry Whitfield and his ancestors, men with the same hollow eyes, proud posture, and the cruel set of mouths used to command lives. Elias's expression was unreadable. "Why do you stare at them?" Margaret asked softly. Elias turned slowly, his voice low. "To see how much of them I carry. They're gone." He stepped closer to her. "Nothing is ever gone, Margaret. Not here." Her throat tightened. The way he said her name, it was both tender and terrible. She remembered when he had been a man of flesh and defiance, when the lines on his hands came from work, not from fire. But now, his eyes carried something old, something inherited from the soil itself. Margaret knew something had awakened in him that night by the furnace. Something ancient, older than the bloodlines that ruled the land. She tried to distract herself, to bring normalcy back into the house. She gathered the ledgers, balanced accounts, even ordered new furniture from Savannah. But every task led her back to that one truth: everything in that home belonged to ghosts. The letters came next. At first 1 or 2, then dozens. All addressed to Henry Whitfield. Delivered by writers who swore they'd been told to send them years ago, delayed only by flooded roads or missing routes. But the dates, 1812, 1815, didn't lie. These were messages from the dead. Margaret opened one at random. "The revolt has begun. The slaves have burned the cane fields, and the masters are being hunted in the night. I fear this will reach your land next. If you have not done what you promised, God help us all." She read another. "They say the woman of fire walks among the slaves. The one you spoke of, Esperanza de Lima. She is the mother of the boy you bought from New Orleans. Do you understand what that means?" Margaret froze. The ink seemed to move under her eyes. Esperanza de Lima. She remembered that name, barely. A tale once whispered in church pews about a woman who burned 17 men alive in a coal furnace for the murder of her child. The same number Elias had spoken into the furnace. Her mind reeled. She ran to the study, the letter clutched in her hand. "Elias," she said breathlessly, "who was your mother?" He didn't answer at first. His back was to her, shoulders rigid, as though he already knew what she had found. "Tell me," she pressed, stepping closer. Slowly he turned. His face was calm, but his eyes glowed faintly, like embers buried under ash. "I never knew her name," he said. "Only the songs she used to hum." Margaret handed him the letter. He took it without looking down. "I've read them all," he said quietly. "They started arriving weeks ago. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to be sure." "Sure of what?" "That the blood in my veins isn't entirely human." Her breath caught. "You think you're cursed?" Elias gave a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "No, Margaret. I think I'm justice." The fire in the hearth crackled, higher than before. The shadows danced across the walls, forming shapes, faces, bodies, echoes of those long dead. Margaret backed away as the air turned hot and heavy. "Elias, stop," she whispered. But he didn't move. He stepped into the firelight, his silhouette wavering, the air rippling around him. "They made monsters of us," he said softly. "My mother was punished for burning their flesh. I was born to finish what she began." He reached into the flames, his hand unscathed. The fire bent toward him, drawn as though it recognized him. "You said I could leave," he murmured, looking at her. "But I can't. The land won't let me." Margaret's tears welled as she took a step forward. "You're not bound to them. You're not your mother's curse." He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment she saw the man he used to be. But then the light shifted, and all that remained was something vast and sorrowful. "Margaret," he said softly, "there are 17 graves on this land. But only 16 bodies." Her eyes widened. "Whose is missing?" He didn't answer. The window burst open, a gust of ash sweeping into the room. Papers flew, the candles blew out, and for one blinding instant she saw a figure standing behind Elias, a woman in soot-stained white, her eyes hollow and burning with the same fire. Then the vision was gone. When Margaret opened her eyes, Elias was standing where the fire had been. The hearth was cold. The room smelled of smoke and roses. He whispered, "She's here." And from somewhere deep below, beneath the boards, beneath the roots and stone, came a woman's voice singing softly in Spanish, a lullaby of vengeance and return. The song did not end. It grew. It began as a hum under the floorboards, low and melodic, like wind through a tomb. Then it rose through the walls, through the pipes, the glass, the very marrow of the house, until it seemed the manor itself was breathing. Margaret clutched the table to steady herself as the chandelier swayed above her, its crystals trembling with the rhythm of something alive. Elias stood unmoving at the center of it all. The hearth behind him blazed to life on its own, its flames shifting shape, faces of men twisting, crying, then dissolving into smoke. Each scream was muffled as though trapped behind time. "Elias," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking, "what's happening?" His eyes were distant, glowing with a fevered knowing. "She's calling," he said. "She's been calling for years. I just never listened." The song changed, no longer a lullaby but a dirge. A melody of ash and sorrow. The kind sung at burials without bodies. Margaret felt it pulling at her, an invisible current dragging her toward the basement door. The air around her grew hot, heavy with the scent of coal and something older, iron, sweat, blood. She stumbled down the steps before she could think. The cellar was darker than she remembered, the air suffocating. Yet there was light ahead, a faint red pulse flickering from the old furnace that hadn't been used in decades. It was open. Inside no fire burned. But there was motion, something glowing deep within like the heart of a dying star. Shadows crawled across the walls, forming outlines of the 17 men who once ruled this land. And among them, Esperanza de Lima. Margaret froze as the apparition stepped forward, her gown torn, her hair unbound, her eyes twin embers in the dark. She moved with the grace of memory, her feet leaving no sound. Elias followed behind, descending the last step without fear. "Mother," he said. Esperanza turned toward him, her gaze heavy with sorrow. "You are what they feared," she whispered in Spanish. "The child of chains and fire." The furnace roared suddenly, spilling light across the room. Margaret shielded her eyes. When she looked again, the walls seemed to breathe, each brick glowing with trapped heat. The air shimmered as if the souls of the burned were stirring. Esperanza's voice was both beautiful and unbearable. "Do you know why I burned them, my son?" Elias lowered his head. "Because they took everything from you." Her voice sharpened. "No. Because they never believed a woman could do what a man deserved." The furnace flared higher, and in the flames, Margaret saw flashes, 17 men screaming as they burned alive, a woman's hands covered in soot, her face lit with calm, divine rage. "You inherited my pain," Esperanza said, her tone softening. "But pain alone is not justice." Elias's jaw tightened. "They enslaved us. They took our names, our graves, our children. Tell me, what else is left to give them but their own fire?" Esperanza reached for him, her hand a wisp of smoke that touched his cheek. "If you burn their memory, you will burn yourself too." For a heartbeat, silence. Then the ground trembled. A second voice echoed from the walls, not Esperanza's, not Elias's. A chorus of the dead, 17 deep, speaking in one single breath. "We were never forgiven." The floorboards above creaked. Margaret could hear the manor groaning under the weight of its own sins. Dust rained from the ceiling. The portraits upstairs began to fall one by one. Elias turned toward the sound, his face lit by the infernal glow. "They're waking." Esperanza's eyes filled with something between pride and dread. "Then you must decide who you are before dawn." The furnace door slammed shut with a deafening clang. Sparks erupted, swirling into shapes, faces, hands reaching, chains twisting. Margaret screamed as the heat became unbearable. Elias stepped closer to the flames. "You can rest now, mother. I'll finish it." But Esperanza shook her head slowly. "It was never meant to be finished. Justice is not fire, it's memory." Her form flickered, the edges dissolving like smoke pulled by wind. Her last words drifted as an echo, "Remember me as the beginning, not the end." Then she was gone. The furnace dimmed, but it did not die. It pulsed, steady and alive, like a heart buried in iron. Elias turned away, his face calm but unreadable. Margaret sank to her knees, trembling. "Elias, what did she mean?" He looked at her, eyes no longer glowing, just hollow, exhausted. "It means I'm not meant to destroy what they built. I'm meant to rebuild what they erased." He helped her up. Together they walked up the basement stairs, though the steps seemed longer than before, each one a century in itself. When they emerged, dawn had begun to bleed through the windows. But outside the fields were blackened, the cane gone, the soil cracked. The air shimmered faintly, like something sacred had passed through. Elias stood in the doorway looking out. His hands were clean, his eyes steady. For the first time he looked neither master nor slave, only a man between two worlds. Margaret whispered, "What happens now?" He didn't answer immediately. He watched the rising sun burn against the horizon, its light cutting through the smoke. Then he said, "Now the land remembers." Behind them the old furnace pulsed once more, a single glow, faint and rhythmic, like the last breath of a dying god. The fire spread in silence. It didn't roar like most fires. It moved slow, deliberate, almost reverent, as if it knew exactly where to go and what to touch. The fields that had once fed generations of cruel men ignited like dry parchment, each stalk of cane bending in surrender. The morning sun met the smoke halfway, turning the sky a strange shade of gold and crimson. Margaret and Elias stood at the edge of the veranda, watching the horizon melt. The land was alive, whispering. The crackle of flame mixed with voices, names, prayers, warnings, spoken in tongues long buried. Margaret clutched her shawl around her shoulders. "It's consuming everything," she said softly. Elias's expression didn't change. His eyes reflected the fire but not fear. "No," he murmured. "It's cleansing." The words unsettled her. "Cleansing what?" "Memory," he replied. "Pain. History. Every scream this land ever buried." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint echo of chains dragging through ash. Margaret's stomach turned. For a moment she thought she saw shapes in the distance. Figures walking through the smoke, their outlines tall, proud, free. The workers. The ones who had vanished. She stepped forward, but Elias caught her arm. "Don't," he warned. "They're not meant for us anymore." She turned to him. "You think this is salvation?" He looked past her, toward the distant chapel at the far end of the estate, the one built by Elias's father generations ago. "No," he said finally. "It's reckoning." As they walked across the scorched courtyard, Margaret noticed how the air shimmered differently around him. The flames seemed to part wherever he stepped, bowing slightly before closing again. The manor behind them began to groan, its foundations creaking, the glass windows shattering one by one as if some invisible force was pulling the soul out of the walls. Inside, portraits of dead men burned from the eyes outward, until only faceless shapes remained. Margaret paused to look back. This house, everything in it. Elias didn't turn around. It was built on suffering. It should end the same way. They reached the chapel. The door was open, though no one had touched it. Inside, the pews were empty but warm, as if a congregation had just risen and left. On the altar sat a single object, a charred Bible, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. Elias approached slowly. "My father used to preach from this," he said, his voice low. "He said obedience was holy. He said the lash was divine justice." He brushed the cover with his fingers and it fell apart, turning to dust. Margaret swallowed hard. "Then why come here?" He looked up at the crucifix above the altar. The face of Christ had been melted by heat, half erased, half remade. "Because I have to replace one faith with another," he whispered. He knelt before the altar. "Forgive us," he said, not as a plea but as a command. "Not for what we did but for what we let them do in our name." The ground trembled. The fire outside surged, crawling up the chapel walls, licking the stained glass windows until they burst into color. 1,000 tiny shards of light scattered across the pews, painting the room in blood-red hues. Margaret fell to her knees. "Elias." He didn't move. His voice grew louder, steadier. "You called them gods but they were just men. You called this land holy but it was cursed. You called me a sin but I am the seed of your truth." As he spoke, the crucifix cracked down the middle, splitting the melted figure of Christ. From the fracture poured a river of light, pure, blinding, searing. It filled the chapel, swallowing both of them. Margaret screamed, covering her eyes. When she dared to look again, the fire was gone. The walls of the chapel stood untouched, glowing faintly with warmth. Outside, the fields were blackened, the smoke rising into a pale blue sky. The air smelled of soot and salt, but also of rain. Elias was kneeling still, his hands resting on his knees. But his eyes were different, clear, calm, human. What happened?" Margaret whispered. He looked up at her, a faint smile forming. "It's over." She frowned. "The fire?" He shook his head. "The silence." They stepped outside together. The world beyond the chapel was quiet. Not dead, alive in a strange new way. The soil steamed faintly, the last embers glowing under the ash like scattered stars. A single bird landed on a charred fence post, its feathers bright against the ruin. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. All those lives, all that history, gone? Elias turned to her. "Not gone," he said softly. "Freed." For the first time the wind was cool. The air felt lighter, the sky cleaner. The land that had once been a graveyard of suffering now looked like it could breathe again. As they walked back toward the manor's remains, Elias stopped by a patch of untouched ground. He knelt and pressed his palm into the dirt. "It'll grow again," he said. Margaret tilted her head. "What will?" Something that doesn't need chains to stand tall. She knelt beside him. You think people will believe this story? He smiled faintly. They won't need to. The land will tell it. In the distance, thunder rolled, a low, gentle promise of rain. The first drops began to fall, hissing as they touched the smoldering earth. Steam rose around them, wrapping them in a ghostly mist. For a moment, it almost looked like the souls were rising too, not in torment but in release. Margaret closed her eyes, listening to the sound of rain meeting fire. It was the sound of ending and beginning. When she opened them again, Elias was already walking ahead, his coat damp, his figure fading into the mist. Elias, she called. He paused but didn't turn around. Tell them, he said. Tell them who she was. Tell them why we burned. Then he disappeared into the smoke. The rain fell harder, washing over the blackened fields, sinking deep into the soil that would one day bloom again. And for the first time in over a century, the manor grounds were silent, not with sorrow but with peace. By the time the rains ended, nothing of the old plantation remained. Only the bones of the earth, charred fences, melted hinges, scattered bricks half swallowed by mud. The air carried a scent that was neither sweet nor bitter, but ancient, like something long asleep had just exhaled. Weeks passed before anyone dared return. Travelers spoke of strange lights at night, of whispers along the riverbank, of a woman's shadow standing in the rain, singing songs that no one remembered. Others swore they saw a man walking through the blackened cane rows at dawn, his hands behind his back as if inspecting his work. Elias had become a rumor, a myth, a ghost that history couldn't bury. The nearest town, where men had once drunk to his downfall, now spoke his name only in candlelight. Preachers called him the redeemed slave. Merchants called him the mad reaper. But the elders, those who had felt the weight of chains and the sharpness of silence, called him something else. They called him the judge. Margaret stayed by the ruins. The widow who had once owned a dozen servants now lived in a small stone cottage by the river. She kept no mirror, no portraits, no gold. Each morning she walked to the edge of the blackened field and waited until the mist cleared. She said that's when she could still feel him there. Sometimes she spoke to him aloud. It's growing, she'd whisper, brushing her hand across the damp soil. And indeed something was. Tiny green shoots began to rise from the ashes. Not sugar cane. Not cotton. Wildflowers, white, yellow, soft and defiant. A kind of beauty that didn't serve profit, that grew simply because it could. The townsfolk mocked her at first. The widow's gone mad, they said. She plants flowers where kings planted gold. But those who ventured too close found the ground strangely warm, as if the earth still remembered the fire and refused to forget. Margaret didn't care for their words. She had learned the difference between madness and memory. One night, when the moon was thin as a blade, she sat by the cottage window, writing by the light of a dying candle. The sound of the river filled the room. Her hand trembled as she wrote the title across the page, The Testament of Ashes. It wasn't a confession, it was a record. She wrote of Elias's birth in the slave quarters. Of the day he first looked his master in the eye. Of the night he killed him, not out of rage but out of something older, something righteous. She wrote of how the land had turned on its own cruelty, of the fire that freed the nameless dead. She didn't spare herself either. She wrote of complicity, of silence, of love found too late. When she finished, she bound the pages in cloth and placed them beneath the chapel's stone altar, the same one where Elias had knelt. Then she whispered, "It's yours now." She never wrote again. Years turned to decades. The plantation's name faded from maps, its history lost in the polite silence of progress. But travelers still spoke of the fields that glowed faintly under moonlight, of flowers that bloomed even in drought, of voices that hummed softly in the wind. And then, long after Margaret was gone, a new owner came. A foreign man with grand ideas and pale hands. He wanted to rebuild the land, make it profitable again. He ordered his workers to clear the flowers and dig new trenches. On the first day of work, the sky turned black before noon. The wind rose without warning, scattering the men like insects. One of them claimed the earth had spoken. 3 words. In a voice like smoke. Leave it be. By morning the new owner was gone, vanished without a trace. His wagon stood untouched at the gate, his papers fluttering across the road. No one returned after that. The land was left to the wild. Centuries later, when historians rediscovered the region, they found no ruins, only an endless field of wildflowers stretching as far as the eye could see. Beneath one patch where the soil was darker, they uncovered a slab of black stone. It bore no name, only an inscription carved by hand. "We were never free until we burned." The scholars called it a memorial. The villagers called it a warning. But those who came at dusk, who stood long enough to feel the air shift, swore they heard footsteps behind them, steady, calm, deliberate. A man's shadow walking between the flowers, stopping only to look toward the horizon where the old manor once stood. If you listened closely, you could hear his voice, faint but certain. "This land remembers." And when the wind passed through the blooms, it almost sounded like applause. The story of Elias, the slave who killed his master, married the widow, and became the owner of the very soil that once enslaved him, never made it into the history books. But it lived where history could not reach, in whispers and wildflowers, in the hearts of those who still felt unseen. Because legends aren't written to be believed. They're written to be remembered. If this tale found you tonight, let it rest with a like, and wake again with a subscribe. The past is still speaking, and somewhere, its fire has not yet gone out.